The old man had counted sunrises for 73 years, and, for the last 20 of them, he had counted them alone. His weathered hands knew the weight of solitude better than they knew the warmth of another human touch. The ranch stretched endlessly around him like a kingdom of memories, where the only conversations were with ghosts and the only laughter came from old recordings playing on a broken radio. But, on this particular morning, as dust clouds appeared on the horizon like approaching storm fronts, Marcus Webb had no idea that his carefully constructed world of isolation was about to shatter. 6 strangers were coming to his gate, carrying secrets that would turn his understanding of family, love, and belonging completely upside down. They would kneel before him not as beggars, but as family he never knew existed, with a story so extraordinary it would make him question everything he thought he knew about his own life. Sometimes the greatest gifts arrive disguised as the most impossible surprises, and sometimes a man who has spent decades learning to live without hope discovers that hope was simply waiting for the right moment to find its way home. Marcus Webb had learned to measure time not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of his daily routines. Each morning at 5:30, his boots hit the wooden floor of his bedroom with the same heavy thud that had echoed through the old ranch house for the past 2 decades. The sound had once been accompanied by the gentle stirring of his wife Sarah, but now it resonated alone through empty rooms that held more memories than furniture. The coffee maker gurgled to life in the kitchen, its mechanical breathing the only company Marcus allowed himself in those quiet morning hours. Through the window above the sink, he could see the vast expanse of the W Ranch stretching toward mountains that touched the sky like ancient guardians. 3,000 acres of rolling grassland, weathered fencing, and cattle that had become more like old friends than livestock. It was a kingdom built by his grandfather's calloused hands, expanded by his father's determination, and now maintained by Marcus alone. At 73, Marcus had the kind of face that told stories without words. Deep lines carved by decades of sun and wind created a map of hard work across his features. His gray hair, always hidden beneath a well-worn Stetson, had thinned over the years, but his blue eyes remained sharp and clear. Those eyes had seen births and deaths, good years and drought years, the rise and fall of cattle prices, and the slow exodus of neighbors who had given up on ranch life for easier dreams in distant cities. The morning routine never varied. Coffee first, black and strong enough to wake the dead. Then, a walk around the property to check on the animals and inspect fences that seemed to find new ways to break despite his constant attention. The cattle knew his schedule better than any timepiece. They would gather near the feeding areas just as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, their patient lowing a chorus that had replaced human conversation in Marcus's daily life. Sarah used to say that Marcus talked to the animals more than he talked to people, and she had not been wrong. Now, 20 years after her death from cancer, the habit had grown into something deeper than mere eccentricity. The cattle listened without judgment, the horses responded to the tone of his voice rather than the content of his words, and the old border collie named Duke, who had died 3 years ago, had been the last creature on earth to look at Marcus with something approaching unconditional love. The ranch had been in the Webb family for over a century. Marcus's great-grandfather had claimed the land during a time when the West was still being written in blood, sweat, and stubborn determination. Each generation had added their own chapter to the story, building barns, expanding pastures, and creating a legacy that was supposed to continue through children and grandchildren who would carry the family name into the future. But Marcus and Sarah had never been blessed with children. They had tried for years, visiting doctors in the city, exploring every medical avenue available, and, finally, accepting what seemed to be God's will with the kind of quiet resignation that comes to couples who love each other enough to find completeness in their partnership. They had poured their parental instincts into the ranch instead, nurturing the land and animals with the same devotion they would have given to sons and daughters. The silence that had descended over the ranch after Sarah's death was not just the absence of her voice, but the absence of shared dreams. No children meant no heirs. No heirs meant that the W Ranch, this kingdom that had been built across 4 generations, would die with Marcus. The lawyers had already explained the options. He could sell to developers who would divide the land into suburban plots, or to corporate ranchers who would strip mine the soul out of the place for maximum profit. Neither option felt like honoring the legacy his ancestors had built with their bare hands. Marcus had made peace with ending the family line, or at least he told himself he had. During the long winter evenings, when the wind howled through the rafters and the silence pressed against him like a physical weight, he sometimes wondered what his life might have been if Sarah had lived longer, if children had filled the empty bedrooms upstairs, if grandchildren had run laughing through the kitchen where he now sat alone with his coffee and his memories. The nearest neighbors lived 12 miles away. The Hendersons had been good friends once, back when Sarah was alive, and social obligations felt like pleasures rather than chores. Now Marcus saw them maybe 3 times a year, usually when weather emergencies required neighbors to check on each other. The rest of the time, he existed in a bubble of self-imposed isolation that had grown thicker and more impenetrable with each passing season. Technology had crept into even remote corners of the world, but Marcus had resisted most of it. He had a landline telephone that rang perhaps once a month, usually from someone trying to sell him insurance or extended warranties for vehicles he did not own. He had a television that picked up 3 channels on good days, and a radio that sometimes managed to find a clear signal from the city 60 miles away. He had never owned a computer, never sent an email, and viewed cell phones as tools for people who had forgotten how to be comfortable with their own thoughts. The mail came every other day, delivered by a postal worker named Jenny who had been making the rural route for 15 years. She was one of the few people who still made regular contact with Marcus, though their conversations never extended beyond pleasantries about the weather and the condition of the road. Most days brought nothing but advertisements for services he did not want and catalogs for products he did not need. Occasionally, there would be a bill for utilities or property taxes, reminders of his connection to a world that otherwise seemed content to forget he existed. Marcus had created his own economy within the boundaries of the ranch. He raised enough cattle to provide a modest income, grew a garden that supplied vegetables through the summer months, and preserved enough food to see him through the harsh winters. He cut his own firewood, maintained his own equipment, and had developed skills in carpentry, plumbing, and basic veterinary care that made him almost completely self-sufficient. It was a life that his great-grandfather would have recognized and respected, even if the world around the ranch had changed beyond recognition. The seasons marked the passage of time more clearly than any calendar. Spring brought the excitement of new calves and the satisfaction of watching grass emerge from winter's brown death. Summer meant long days of hay cutting, fence repair, and the constant vigilance required to keep livestock healthy in the heat. Fall was roundup time, when Marcus hired temporary help from the city to assist with moving cattle and preparing for winter. Winter was the season of endurance, when snow could isolate the ranch for days at a time and survival depended on preparation and determination. Each season also brought its own set of memories. Spring reminded him of Sarah's excitement over the first wildflowers. Summer carried echoes of picnic lunches shared in the shade of cottonwood trees. Fall brought back images of Sarah canning vegetables in the kitchen, her face flushed from the heat of the stove and her laugh filling the house like music. Winter was the hardest season because it was when Sarah had died, when the cold and silence had combined to create a loneliness that settled into Marcus's bones like arthritis. The house itself had become a museum of their life together. Sarah's reading chair still sat in the living room, positioned to catch the afternoon light that streamed through the west window. Her books remained on the shelves, their pages yellowed but their memories intact. The kitchen still contained her collection of ceramic roosters, gathered over years of visits to antique shops and craft fairs. Marcus had not moved anything, had not donated her clothes or discarded her personal belongings. He had simply closed the door to their bedroom and moved into the guest room down the hall, preserving their shared space like a shrine to what had been. The loneliness was not constant or crushing. There were moments when Marcus found genuine contentment in his solitary existence. The satisfaction of a job well done, the beauty of a sunset over the mountains, the simple pleasure of a hot meal after a cold day of outdoor work. These moments of peace had taught him that happiness did not require constant company, that a man could find meaning in the rhythms of work and the cycles of nature without needing human validation or approval. But there were also moments when the silence became oppressive, when the absence of conversation made him question whether he still remembered how to connect with other human beings. Sometimes he would catch himself talking aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was only his own. Sometimes he would drive to town just to be around other people, even if he did not speak to anyone beyond ordering supplies or brocating necessities. The people in town treated him with the kind of respectful distance reserved for harmless eccentrics. He was known as the old rancher who kept to himself, paid his bills on time, and never caused trouble. Shopkeepers were polite but not warm. Bank tellers processed his transactions efficiently but did not engage in small talk. The younger generation seemed to look through him as if he were invisible, a relic from a time they could not imagine and did not care to understand. Marcus had convinced himself that this was the way his story would end. He would continue maintaining the ranch until age or illness made it impossible, then he would make arrangements for the land to be sold and the proceeds donated to charity. He would die quietly, probably alone, and, after a brief funeral attended by a handful of acquaintances, the Webb family name would disappear from the county records. It seemed like a peaceful enough ending to a life that had contained its share of joy and sorrow, love and loss. The routine of solitude had become so deeply ingrained that Marcus no longer noticed it as unusual. He woke, worked, ate, and slept according to patterns he had established through decades of practice. He had learned to find companionship in memories, entertainment in work, and purpose in the simple act of maintaining something that his ancestors had built. It was not the life he had imagined as a young man, but it was the life he had learned to live with dignity and acceptance. On the morning that would change everything, Marcus followed his routine exactly as he had for the past 20 years. He made his coffee, checked his animals, and settled into the rhythm of another day that would be much like all the others. The sky was clear, the temperature mild for early autumn, and the cattle were contentedly grazing in the north pasture. There was fence work to be done in the afternoon, hay to be moved from the upper barn, and a dozen other small tasks that would fill the daylight hours with familiar purpose. Nothing in the morning routine suggested that this day would be different from any other. The coffee tasted the same, the animals behaved normally, and the mountains stood in their eternal positions like sentries guarding the horizon. Marcus had no reason to expect that his carefully ordered world was about to be transformed by visitors who would arrive with revelations that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his family, his life, and his place in a larger story that had been unfolding for generations without his knowledge. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, when Marcus was repairing a section of fence near the main road. At first, he thought it might be the mail truck running late, or perhaps one of the Henderson boys taking a shortcut across the county road. But, as he watched through squinted eyes, shading them with a work-gloved hand, he realized that the dust was moving too slowly for a single vehicle and creating too much disturbance for anything ordinary. Marcus set down his tools and walked closer to the fence line, his boots crunching through the dry autumn grass. The dust cloud was definitely heading toward the ranch, following the gravel road that led to his front gate. As it drew nearer, he could make out not one vehicle, but several, moving in a convoy-like formation that suggested purpose rather than coincidence. In all his years of living on the ranch, Marcus could not remember seeing so many vehicles approaching his property at once. His first thought was that developers had finally decided to make an uninvited inspection of the land they hoped to purchase when he died. There had been phone calls over the years, letters from real estate companies, and even a few bold individuals who had shown up unannounced to discuss the future of the W Ranch. Marcus had sent them all away with varying degrees of politeness, but perhaps they had decided that persistence might succeed where diplomacy had failed. But, as the vehicles drew closer, Marcus began to doubt his initial assumption. The cars were not the expensive sedans or luxury SUVs that developers typically drove when they wanted to impress potential sellers. Instead, he could see what appeared to be a mix of older model vehicles, pickup trucks, and even what looked like a small moving van. This was not the fleet of successful businesspeople, but something else entirely. Marcus walked back to the house, his mind working through possibilities as he moved with the measured pace of a man who had learned that rushing rarely improved any situation. He climbed the steps to the front porch and settled into the wooden rocking chair that had been Sarah's favorite spot for watching the road and waiting for visitors who rarely came. From this elevated position, he had a clear view of the approaching convoy and could study it more carefully as it navigated the final mile of gravel road that led to his gate. The lead vehicle was a blue pickup truck that had seen better days, its paint faded and its bumper dented from years of honest work. Behind it came a small sedan, a larger SUV, another pickup truck that might once have been green, a compact car that was definitely past its prime, and, bringing up the rear, a small U-Haul truck that bounced and swayed as it hit the inevitable potholes that Marcus had never bothered to repair since he so rarely had visitors. As the convoy drew closer, Marcus could see that each vehicle carried multiple passengers. There were people of different ages, from what appeared to be elderly adults to young children pressed against windows, their faces turned toward the ranch house with expressions that Marcus could not quite read from his distance. The sight of children was particularly unusual. Marcus could not remember the last time children had visited the ranch, and their presence suggested that this was not a business call or a casual social visit. The lead truck slowed as it approached the gate, and Marcus watched as a man got out to open the metal barrier that Marcus kept latched but never locked. The man was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair and a build that suggested outdoor work. He handled the gate with the kind of familiarity that comes from a lifetime of dealing with ranch equipment, which struck Marcus as odd since he was certain he had never seen this person before in his life. Once the gate was open, the convoy proceeded up the quarter-mile driveway that led to the house. The vehicles moved slowly, as if the drivers were taking time to observe their surroundings, to absorb the sight of the barns and outbuildings, the cattle in the distance, and the house itself with its wraparound porch and steep metal roof that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Marcus felt a strange mixture of pride and vulnerability as he realized that strangers were seeing his private kingdom for the first time, judging his life's work through eyes that carried unknown expectations and purposes. The vehicles came to a stop in the circular driveway in front of the house, their engines ticking and settling as they cooled. Car doors began to open, and people emerged with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested nervousness or uncertainty. Marcus remained seated in his rocking chair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests as he watched a scene that seemed almost surreal in its strangeness. The first person to approach the porch was the man who had opened the gate. He was followed by a woman of similar age with long brown hair and eyes that seemed familiar in a way that Marcus could not immediately place. Behind them came an elderly couple who moved with the careful steps of people whose bodies had been shaped by decades of hard work, and, behind them, a younger man and woman with two small children who clung to their parents' hands as they stared at the old man on the porch. The group arranged itself in a loose semicircle at the base of the porch steps, and Marcus was struck by the way they seemed to be studying his face with an intensity that went far beyond normal curiosity. There was something in their expressions that suggested recognition, as if they were comparing him to a mental image they had carried for a long time. It was the kind of look that family members shared when meeting after years of separation, but Marcus was certain he had never seen any of these people before in his life. The man who had opened the gate stepped forward, removing a worn baseball cap to reveal hair that was prematurely gray at the temples. When he spoke, his voice carried a slight tremor that might have been emotion or nervousness. "Mr. Webb," he said, and the way he pronounced the name carried a weight that suggested it meant more to him than simple identification. "My name is David Martinez. This is my wife, Susan, and my family." He gestured to the group behind him, and Marcus noticed that several of the adults were fighting back tears, as if this moment carried significance that he could not understand. "We've been looking for you for a long time," David continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "We know this might be hard to believe, and we know we should have called first, but we weren't sure how to explain over the phone. We're family, Mr. Webb. We're your family." Marcus felt the world shift slightly, as if the foundation of reality had developed a crack that threatened to spread. The word family hung in the air between them like a question that demanded an answer he did not have. He had no family. The Webb line ended with him. This was a fact he had accepted and planned for, a truth that had shaped every decision he had made about the future of the ranch. "I think you might be confused," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the confusion that was building in his mind. "I don't have any family. My wife and I never had children, and I was an only child myself. There's no one left with the Webb name except me." The elderly woman in the group stepped forward, and, when she spoke, her voice carried an accent that seemed to place her somewhere south of the border. "Senor Webb," she said, and there were definitely tears in her eyes now. "We are not Webb family. We are Martinez family. But, we are your family just the same." Marcus felt his grip on the armrests tighten as the woman continued speaking. "Your great-grandfather, he had a brother who came to Mexico many years ago. That brother, he started a family there, but he never lost touch with the family here. We have been keeping track of the Webbs for generations, waiting for the right time to make contact." The younger man in the group spoke up, his voice carrying the clear diction of someone who had spent time in schools and offices rather than barns and fields. "We know this is overwhelming, sir. We have documents, photographs, letters that prove the connection. My great-great-grandfather was Thomas Webb, the brother of your great-grandfather Samuel Webb. Thomas settled in Chihuahua in the 1890s and raised a large family there." Marcus felt his mind struggling to process information that seemed to challenge everything he thought he knew about his own history. He had heard stories about Samuel Webb, the founder of the Double W Ranch, but he had never heard mention of a brother named Thomas. The family history as he knew it was a straight line of inheritance from father to son, with no branches or complications that might create unexpected relatives appearing on his doorstep after decades of silence. "Even if what you're saying is true," Marcus said slowly, working through the implications as he spoke, "that would make you very distant relatives. Fourth or fifth cousins, maybe. Not exactly close family." David Martinez stepped forward again, and Marcus could see that the man was struggling with some internal decision about how much to reveal and how quickly. "Mr. Webb, there's more to the story than just old genealogy. The family stayed in touch longer than you might think. There were letters, visits, even some business dealings between the ranches. Your grandfather knew about us, and your father knew about us too." The statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. His father had never mentioned Mexican relatives or cross-border family connections. His father had been a man of few words, but he had shared stories about the family history and the building of the ranch. The idea that there had been entire chapters of that history that Marcus had never heard seemed impossible to accept. "My father never said anything about relatives in Mexico," Marcus said, and he could hear the defensive tone in his own voice. "He would have told me something that important." The elderly man in the group spoke for the first time, his English heavily accented but clearly understandable. "Senor Marcus," he said, and the use of his first name felt presumptuous and intimate at the same time, "your father knew about us because he visited us. In 1965, he came to our ranch in Chihuahua with your mother. They stayed for 2 weeks and met the whole family. There are photographs." Marcus felt reality continue to shift around him as the elderly man reached into a jacket pocket and produced a small bundle of photographs held together with a rubber band. He held them out toward Marcus with hands that shook slightly from age or emotion. "We brought these for you to see," the man continued. "They show your parents with our family, at our ranch, during that visit. Your father, he talked about bringing you to meet us when you were older, but, then, your mother got sick, and, after she died, your father never came back. Marcus stared at the offered photographs but did not reach for them immediately. Accepting them would mean accepting the possibility that there were fundamental aspects of his own life story that he did not know, that his parents had kept secrets from him that had shaped decisions and relationships in ways he could not imagine. It would mean acknowledging that his understanding of his own identity might be incomplete or even incorrect. The woman named Susan stepped forward, her voice gentle but persistent. "Mr. Webb, we know this is a shock. We debated for years about whether to contact you, especially after we learned that you and your wife never had children. But, when we realized that you might be planning to sell the ranch to strangers, we felt like we had to try to reconnect. This land, this ranch, it's part of our family history too." Marcus looked at the faces surrounding him, studying them for any features that might seem familiar, any resemblance that might support their extraordinary claims. The children were too young to show much family resemblance, but the adults carried certain characteristics that might have been shared traits or might simply have been the result of similar lifestyles and heritage. The elderly woman had eyes that were the same shade of blue as Marcus's own, and the younger man had a jawline that reminded Marcus of photographs he had seen of his own grandfather. "Why now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "If this connection is real, why wait until now to make contact?" David Martinez looked at the rest of the group as if seeking permission to continue, then turned back to Marcus with an expression of resolve. "Because we just learned something that changes everything, Mr. Webb. We learned that you might not be as alone as you think. There's something else about the family history that we need to share with you, something that might affect your decisions about the ranch and your future." Marcus felt his heart begin to beat faster as he realized that whatever revelations had already been shared were apparently just the beginning of a conversation that threatened to upend everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, and his place in a story that was much larger and more complicated than he had ever imagined. Marcus finally reached for the photographs with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age, emotion, or the shock of discovering that his life story might be fundamentally different than he had believed, he could not say. The bundle felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the possibility of truths he was not prepared to accept. As he removed the rubber band and looked at the first photograph, his carefully constructed understanding of his own history began to crumble. The black and white image showed a group of people standing in front of a ranch house that was clearly not the Double W, but which bore enough architectural similarities to suggest common origins or influences. In the center of the group stood a man and woman that Marcus recognized with a shock that felt like an electric current through his chest. His father, younger than Marcus remembered him ever being, stood with his arm around Marcus's mother, who was smiling with the kind of genuine joy that Marcus remembered from his earliest childhood memories. Surrounding his parents were a dozen other people of various ages, all dressed in the simple, practical clothing of ranch families. They were not posing formally, but rather seemed caught in a moment of genuine celebration or reunion. Children played at the edges of the group, and adults laughed at something beyond the camera's view. It was a scene of family happiness that Marcus had never known existed, a gathering that suggested connections and relationships that had been completely absent from his own understanding of his family's history. "When was this taken?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible as he continued to study the photograph. "July 1965, replied the elderly woman, whose name Marcus realized he had not yet learned. "Your father wrote the date on the back, along with the names of everyone in the picture. I am in this photograph, Señor Marcus. I am the young woman standing behind your mother. My name is Rosa Martinez, and I am David's grandmother." Marcus turned the photograph over and saw his father's familiar handwriting, faded but still legible. July 1965, visit to the Martinez Ranch, Chihuahua, Mexico. Never forget family. Below the inscription was a list of names that meant nothing to Marcus but which apparently represented an entire branch of his family tree that had been hidden from him for his entire life. The second photograph showed his parents working alongside the Martinez family members, apparently helping with ranch chores. His mother was hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts, laughing as a small child tugged at her skirt. His father stood near a corral, his hand on the shoulder of a man who bore a strong resemblance to David Martinez, both of them pointing at something in the distance as if sharing knowledge about livestock or land management. They came to help us during a difficult time, Rosa continued, her voice carrying the weight of old gratitude. We had lost cattle to disease, and your father brought medicine from the United States that was not available to us then. He stayed and worked with our men to help rebuild the herd. Your mother taught our children English words while the men worked. Marcus looked through the remaining photographs with growing amazement and confusion. They documented a 2-week visit that had apparently been significant enough to warrant extensive documentation, yet he had no memory of his parents ever mentioning Mexico, Mexican relatives, or any kind of international travel. There were images of his parents sharing meals with the Martinez family, his father examining cattle with obvious expertise, his mother playing with children who looked remarkably similar to the young people who now stood in his own driveway. I don't understand, Marcus said, looking up from the photographs to study the faces of the people who claimed to be his family. Why didn't they ever tell me about this? Why did they keep it secret? David Martinez moved closer to the porch, his expression sympathetic but determined. They didn't mean to keep it secret forever, Mr. Webb. According to the letters we have, your father planned to bring you to meet us when you were older. But, your mother became ill not long after that visit, and, then, your father was dealing with her cancer treatments and trying to manage the ranch alone. After she died, I think the grief made it hard for him to maintain connections that reminded him of happier times. Marcus remembered his mother's illness, the long months of doctor visits and treatments that had drained the family's resources and energy. He had been a teenager then, focused on his own concerns and too young to understand the full weight of what his parents were experiencing. After his mother's death, his father had indeed become more withdrawn and focused entirely on the immediate demands of running the ranch and raising his son alone. But there were letters, added Susan Martinez, speaking up for the first time since the introductions. Your father continued to correspond with our family for several years after your mother died. We have those letters, Mr. Webb. In them, he talks about you, about your progress in school, about his hopes for your future. He never forgot about us, even if he couldn't manage to visit again. The elderly man who had spoken earlier stepped forward and introduced himself properly. I am Miguel Martinez, the grandson of Thomas Webb who came to Mexico. Your great-grandfather's brother was my grandfather. This makes us what you would call second cousins, but, in our culture, we consider this close family. Marcus tried to process the genealogical relationships being described, but found his mind struggling with concepts that challenged everything he thought he knew about his own identity. The idea that he had living relatives, people who shared his bloodline and family history, seemed almost impossible to accept after 7 decades of believing himself to be the last of his line. There's something else, David said, and Marcus could see that the younger man was working up courage to share information that he suspected would be even more difficult to process. The connection between our families didn't end with those visits in the 1960s. There have been other connections, more recent ones that you might not know about. Marcus felt his stomach tighten with apprehension as he realized that the revelations were far from over. What kind of connections? Rosa Martinez reached into a large handbag and produced a manila folder thick with documents. Your wife, Sarah, she knew about us. She had been corresponding with our family for years before she died. She was researching the family history, trying to trace all the connections and relationships that had been lost over time. The statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah had been interested in genealogy, it was true, and she had spent many hours working on family trees and historical research. But she had never mentioned Mexican relatives or cross-border family connections. The idea that his wife of 40 years had kept such significant secrets from him seemed to challenge not just his understanding of his family history, but his understanding of his marriage and his closest relationship. That's impossible, Marcus said, his voice carrying a defensive edge. Sarah would have told me something that important. We didn't keep secrets from each other. Susan Martinez opened the folder and pulled out a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. These are letters from Sarah to our grandmother, Mr. Webb. They started in 1995 and continued until just before she died. In them, she talks about wanting to reconnect the family branches, about her hope that you would eventually meet your Mexican relatives and learn about the full scope of your family history. Marcus stared at the letters with a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. If these people were telling the truth, then both his parents and his wife had participated in keeping fundamental aspects of his own family story hidden from him. It suggested a level of deception that seemed to contradict everything he thought he knew about the people he had loved and trusted most. Why would she do that? Marcus asked, his voice barely controlled. Why would she correspond with strangers behind my back? Rosa Martinez spoke gently, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand the complexities of human relationships. She was not corresponding with strangers, Senor Marcus. She was corresponding with family. And she was not doing it behind your back, but rather preparing for a time when she felt you would be ready to accept the truth about your larger family. David added, according to Sarah's letters, she was concerned about how isolated you had become after your parents died, how much you had withdrawn into the ranch and away from human connections. She thought that learning about extended family might be overwhelming when you were already dealing with grief and change. Marcus tried to remember signs that Sarah had been engaged in secret correspondence, but found his memories frustratingly vague. She had indeed spent time writing letters, but he had assumed they were communications with old friends or distant relatives he had already known about. She had received mail that she handled privately, but he had respected her privacy and never questioned her about personal correspondence. She was waiting for the right time to tell you, Susan continued. But then, she got sick, and, during the last months of her life, she was more focused on preparing you for her death than on introducing you to living relatives you had never met. The words brought back painful memories of Sarah's final months, when cancer had consumed her energy and attention, leaving little room for anything beyond the immediate challenges of treatment and the emotional work of saying goodbye. Marcus remembered how she had spent time writing letters during those months, often working late into the evening when she should have been resting. He had assumed she was corresponding with old friends and distant relatives to whom she wanted to say farewell. In her last letter to us, Rosa said, her voice growing softer, Sarah asked us to wait until you had time to grieve and find your peace before we contacted you. She said that learning about family connections should be a joy, not a burden, and she did not want our presence to become associated with her illness and death. Marcus felt tears building in his eyes as he realized that even in her final months, Sarah had been thinking about his emotional well-being and trying to protect him from additional complications that might have made her death even more difficult to bear. It was exactly the kind of selfless consideration that had characterized their entire marriage, but it also meant that she had died without sharing knowledge that might have changed his life in fundamental ways. She planned to tell you after she recovered, David explained. According to her letters, she wanted to arrange a visit to Mexico, or to invite us to visit the ranch, as a way of celebrating her return to health. When it became clear that she wasn't going to recover, she decided to leave the decision about contact up to us. Marcus looked again at the photographs and letters, trying to reconcile this new version of his family history with everything he had believed for 73 years. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but accepting it would mean acknowledging that the three people he had loved and trusted most in his life had all participated in keeping fundamental truths hidden from him. The youngest members of the group, the children who had been quietly observing the adult conversation, began to grow restless as the afternoon shadows lengthened. One of them, a girl who appeared to be about 6 years old, approached the porch steps and looked up at Marcus with the kind of direct curiosity that only children possess. "Are you our great-uncle Marcus?" she asked in English that carried just a hint of accent. "Mama said we have a great-uncle who has cows and horses and lives in a big house." The innocence of the question, combined with the weight of everything he had learned in the past hour, finally, broke through Marcus's emotional defenses. Tears began to flow down his weathered cheeks as he looked at this child who apparently considered him family, who had traveled hundreds of miles to meet a relative she had never seen but had somehow been taught to love. "I think I might be," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke to the little girl. "But, I'm still trying to figure out how all of this works." The child's mother, a young woman who had not yet spoken, stepped forward to guide her daughter back to the group. "I'm sorry, Mr. Webb. I know this is overwhelming. Maria has been excited about meeting her American family ever since we told her about this trip." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked at the assembled group with new understanding. These were not strangers making claims about distant genealogical connections. These were people who had grown up knowing about him, who had considered him family even when he had no knowledge of their existence. They had made a journey of hundreds of miles, bringing children and elderly relatives, because they believed that family connections were worth preserving and celebrating. "How many of you are there?" Marcus asked, his voice stronger now as he began to accept the reality of what he was learning. "The Martinez family that descends from Thomas Webb numbers in the dozens now," Miguel replied. "We have been in Mexico for over a century, but we have never forgotten our connection to the W Ranch and the Webb family in Colorado. We are ranchers, farmers, teachers, and businesspeople, but we all carry the story of Thomas Webb and his brother Samuel who stayed in the United States." Marcus realized that his understanding of his own identity was about to undergo a fundamental transformation. For 73 years, he had seen himself as the last of his line, the final guardian of a family legacy that would die with him. Now he was learning that the Webb family line had not only survived but had flourished, creating a network of relatives who had maintained connections and memories that he had never known existed. The implications were staggering. If these people were truly his family, then decisions about the ranch, about his legacy, about his own future, would need to be reconsidered in light of relationships and responsibilities he had never imagined. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the porch when Rosa Martinez made a gesture that would change everything. Without speaking, she reached into her bag and pulled out what appeared to be a small, worn wooden box. The box was crafted from dark wood that had been polished smooth by decades of handling, and it bore the distinctive markings of skilled hand carving around its edges. "Señor Marcus," Rosa said, her voice carrying a reverence that suggested the contents of the box held special significance, "there is one more thing we must show you. Something that Sarah asked us to bring when we finally came to meet you." Marcus watched as Rosa carefully opened the box, revealing contents that were clearly precious to her. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay a collection of items that seemed to span decades of family history. There were more photographs, several pieces of jewelry, a few official-looking documents, and what appeared to be a small leather journal tied with a string. "These belonged to Thomas Webb, your great-grandfather's brother," Rosa explained as she lifted the journal from the box. "But some of these items came from your side of the family, given to Thomas during his last visit to the W Ranch in 1923. Marcus felt his breath catch as Rosa handed him the journal. The leather was worn soft by age, and the string that bound it was frayed but still functional. When he opened it, he found pages covered in handwriting that was clearly from another era, written in the careful script that people learned when penmanship was considered an essential skill. The first entry was dated October 15, 1923, and began with words that made Marcus's hands tremble. "Today I said goodbye to my brother Samuel and the W Ranch for what I know will be the last time. I am too old now to make this journey again, and my heart tells me that Samuel's health is failing faster than he admits. But I am grateful for these 2 weeks we have shared, remembering our father and the dreams he had for both of us." Marcus looked up from the journal to study Rosa's face with new intensity. "Thomas kept a diary of his visits to the ranch?" "More than that," Rosa replied. "He kept a record of everything he learned about the family history, everything Samuel told him about their father and grandfather, all the stories and memories that might otherwise have been lost. That journal contains the history of both branches of the Webb family, Senor Marcus. It is the bridge between your knowledge and ours. Marcus turned the pages carefully, reading entries that described the W Ranch as it existed almost a century ago. Thomas had written detailed observations about the buildings, the land, the cattle operation, and the family traditions that Samuel had maintained since their father's death. But, more importantly, the journal revealed the depth of feeling between the two brothers, their regret at the geographical distance that separated them, and their determination to ensure that future generations would understand their connection. One entry, dated October 20, 1923, caught Marcus's attention with its emotional intensity. Samuel showed me the family photographs today, including the one of our father taken just before he died. I had forgotten how much I resemble him, how much we both carry his features and his stubborn determination. Samuel insists that I take the photograph with me to Mexico, so that my children and grandchildren will know their grandfather's face. He also gave me our father's wedding ring, which he said should go to the Mexican branch of the family since I have more sons to pass it down to. Marcus looked up sharply. The ring. Do you still have our great-grandfather's wedding ring? Miguel Martinez stepped forward and slowly removed a simple gold band from his right hand. I have worn this ring every day for 30 years, since my father died and passed it to me. Before that, my father wore it, and, before him, Thomas wore it after Samuel gave it to him in 1923. Marcus stared at the ring, recognizing its simple design and the initials, J.W., engraved on its inner surface. J.W. stood for James Webb, the patriarch who had started both branches of the family tree. Marcus had grown up hearing stories about James Webb, but he had never seen any tangible artifacts from his life. The sight of his great-great-grandfather's wedding ring, worn smooth by generations of family members he had never known existed, made the reality of these family connections impossible to deny. There is something else, Rosa said, reaching back into the wooden box. She withdrew a folded piece of paper that appeared to be much more recent than the other items. This is a letter that Sarah wrote to us in 1998, 3 years before she died. She asked us to read it to you when we finally met. Rosa carefully unfolded the letter, and Marcus recognized Sarah's handwriting immediately. The sight of his wife's familiar script, combined with everything else he had learned, brought fresh tears to his eyes as Rosa began to read, "My dear Martinez family, if you are reading this letter to Marcus, it means that I am gone and that you have decided the time is right to reconnect our family branches. I have spent years learning about your history and your connection to the Webb family, and I have been deeply moved by your loyalty to family bonds that most people would have forgotten long ago." Rosa paused in her reading to look at Marcus with compassion. "Shall I continue, Senor Marcus?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak. Rosa continued reading Sarah's words. "Marcus is a good man with a generous heart, but he has always struggled with loneliness and isolation. After his parents died, he withdrew into the ranch and away from human connections in ways that worried me. Learning about your family has given me hope that he will not have to face the future entirely alone, even after I am gone." The words hit Marcus like a series of physical blows, each one revealing how clearly Sarah had understood aspects of his character that he had thought he was hiding successfully. Her insight into his tendency toward isolation was painfully accurate, and her concern about his future emotional well-being demonstrated a level of care that extended beyond her own life. Rosa continued, "I believe that Marcus needs family more than he realizes, and that you need him as well. The W Ranch represents the American roots of your family tree, and Marcus represents the living connection to Thomas Webb's brother and the dreams they shared. I hope that when you meet, you will find ways to bridge the years of separation and build relationships that will benefit everyone." Marcus wiped his eyes again as Rosa read the final paragraph of Sarah's letter. "Please be patient with Marcus if he seems resistant or skeptical at first. He has spent many years believing himself to be the last of his family line, and learning about your existence will challenge fundamental assumptions about his identity and his future. But, underneath his defensive exterior, you will find a man who deeply values family loyalty, who understands the importance of tradition, and who needs the kind of connections that only blood relatives can provide. Give him time to adjust, and I believe you will find in him the brother and uncle and family patriarch that you have been seeking. When Rosa finished reading, a profound silence settled over the group. Even the children seemed to sense the emotional weight of the moment, standing quietly beside their parents as the adults processed the implications of Sarah's words. Marcus felt as if he were seeing his own life from a completely different perspective, understanding for the first time how his isolation and withdrawal had appeared to the person who knew him best. "She understood me better than I understood myself," Marcus said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "And she knew that I needed you before I knew I needed you." David Martinez stepped closer to the porch, his expression serious but hopeful. "Mr. Webb, there's one more thing we need to discuss. Sarah's last letter to us included a specific request, something she hoped we would do when we finally made contact with you." Marcus looked at David with apprehension, wondering what other surprises this extraordinary day might hold. "What kind of request?" "She asked us to invite you to come to Mexico, to visit the Martinez ranch and meet the rest of the family. She said that seeing how the Mexican branch of the family has grown and prospered might help you understand that the Webb legacy is not ending with you, but rather continuing in ways you had never imagined." The invitation hit Marcus with unexpected force. For decades, he had rarely traveled beyond the boundaries of his own county, let alone considered international travel. The idea of visiting Mexico, meeting dozens of relatives he had never known existed, and seeing a ranch that his great-grandfather's brother had built seemed both terrifying and compelling. "How many family members are there?" Marcus asked. Miguel answered, "In Mexico, there are 47 people who carry Webb blood through Thomas's line. We have spread across several states, but most of us still live in Chihuahua where Thomas settled. We are ranchers, farmers, teachers, doctors, and business owners, but we all share the story of Thomas Webb and his connection to the W Ranch." Marcus tried to imagine meeting 47 relatives at once, after spending 20 years believing he had no family at all. The prospect was overwhelming, but it also carried a strange appeal. For the first time in decades, he was being offered the chance to be part of something larger than his own solitary existence. But Sarah had another request too, Susan added. She hoped that some of the Mexican family might come to live here in the United States, perhaps even help with the ranch. She understood that you were struggling to maintain this place alone, and she thought that having family members involved in the operation might solve problems for everyone. Marcus looked at the group assembled in his driveway with new understanding. This was not simply a social visit or a genealogical exploration. These people were offering to become part of his life in practical, ongoing ways. They were suggesting that the ranch that he had expected to sell to strangers might instead become a family operation that could continue for another generation. "You're talking about permanent relocation," Marcus said, trying to understand the full implications of what was being proposed. "Some of us, yes," David replied. "We've been planning this for months, Mr. Webb. Several families are prepared to move to Colorado if you're willing to have us. We have experience with ranch operations, we understand the hard work involved, and we're ready to invest our own money and effort into making this work." Marcus felt his understanding of his own future shifting once again. For years, he had been planning for the end of the Webb family presence on the W Ranch. Now he was being offered the possibility of a new beginning, with family members who could help preserve and continue the legacy that his great-grandfather had started more than a century ago. The little girl who had spoken to him earlier broke away from her mother and climbed the porch steps, approaching Marcus's chair with the fearless curiosity of childhood. When she reached him, she did something that no one had done in years. She climbed onto his lap and looked up into his weathered face with eyes that seemed to see past his defenses to the loneliness he had carried for so long. "Will you be our grandfather?" she asked in her sweet, accented voice. Mama says we don't have an American grandfather, but maybe you could be ours. The simple question, asked with the directness that only children possess, broke through the last of Marcus's emotional defenses. As he looked down at this little girl who was asking him to become family, he realized that the choice before him was not just about accepting the reality of long-lost relatives or making decisions about the ranch. It was about choosing between continued isolation and the risk of opening his heart to relationships that could transform his understanding of what family means and what legacy truly looks like. Marcus held the little girl on his lap, her warm weight settling against his chest like a missing piece of his life finally clicking into place. Her question about becoming their grandfather echoed in his mind as he looked out at the faces of the people who had traveled so far to find him. For the first time in 20 years, the silence of the ranch was broken not by the wind or the lowing of cattle, but by the sound of human voices and the promise of family connections he had never dared to imagine. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Marcus asked the child, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Maria Elena Martinez Webb," she replied with the precision of a child who had been carefully taught to remember her full name. "Mama says the Webb part comes from you, from our family that stayed in America when Thomas went to Mexico." The hyphenated name struck Marcus with surprising force. These people had not simply maintained awareness of their American family connections, they had incorporated the Webb name into their own identities, carrying it forward through generations as a reminder of their dual heritage. It was a level of family loyalty that Marcus had never experienced but which filled him with a warmth he had thought was lost forever. "Maria Elena," Marcus repeated, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. "That's a beautiful name. How old are you?" 6 3/4, Maria replied with the specificity that children bring to discussions of their age. "And my brother Carlos is 9, but he's shy around new people. Do you want to meet him?" Marcus looked over Maria's head to see a boy who was indeed hanging back near the vehicles, watching the interactions on the porch with the careful attention of someone trying to understand adult complexities. When their eyes met, the boy offered a tentative wave that Marcus returned with a smile that felt rusty from disuse. David Martinez stepped closer to the porch, his expression serious but hopeful. "Mr. Webb, I know this is overwhelming, and we don't expect any immediate decisions. But there's something we'd like to do, something that's traditional in our family when we meet for the first time or after a long separation." Marcus adjusted his hold on Maria and looked at David with curiosity. "What kind of tradition?" "In our culture, when family members are reunited after a long separation, especially when there's been misunderstanding or lost connections, we have a ceremony of recognition and commitment. It's a way of formally acknowledging the family bonds and promising to honor them going forward." Rosa Martinez stepped forward, her aged face glowing with an emotion that Marcus was beginning to recognize as deep affection. "Señor Marcus, would you permit us to show you this ceremony? It would mean very much to our family to be able to formally welcome you back into the family circle." Marcus found himself nodding before he fully understood what he was agreeing to. The need for family connection had been awakened in him so powerfully that he was willing to participate in traditions he did not understand, as long as they offered the possibility of belonging to something larger than his own solitary existence. "What does the ceremony involve?" he asked. Miguel Martinez answered, "It is simple, but meaningful. Each family member will kneel before you and state their connection to you and their commitment to the family bond. Then, you, as the eldest member of the senior family line, will accept us back into the family circle and offer your own commitment to our shared future." The idea of people kneeling before him made Marcus uncomfortable, but he could see in their faces that this ceremony held deep significance for them. These were people who had traveled hundreds of miles and brought multiple generations of family members to participate in what they clearly considered a sacred reunion. "I don't know what to say during something like that," Marcus admitted. "I've never been part of a family ceremony." "You will know what to say when the time comes," Rosa assured him. "The heart speaks its own language when family is reunited." Susan Martinez addressed the practical aspects of the ceremony. "Mr. Webb, we'd like to do this here on your porch, at the heart of the Double W Ranch. This place represents the American roots of our family tree, and, having the ceremony here would connect it to the land that our ancestors built with their own hands." Marcus realized that the ceremony would not just be about accepting these people as family, but about acknowledging his role as a patriarch, something he had never considered himself to be. For decades, he had seen himself as the end of the family line, but now he was being asked to see himself as the beginning of a new chapter in a story that had been unfolding for more than a century. "All right," Marcus said, his voice stronger than he expected. "Let's do this." Maria climbed down from his lap and rejoined her family as they arranged themselves in a semicircle in front of the porch. Marcus stood up from his rocking chair, feeling the weight of the moment and the significance of what was about to happen. The afternoon sun cast a golden light across the scene, illuminating faces that carried features he was beginning to recognize as variations of his own family's characteristics. David Martinez stepped forward first, removing his hat and slowly lowering himself to one knee on the wooden porch steps. When he spoke, his voice carried the formality of ritual but also the warmth of genuine emotion. "Marcus Webb, I am David Martinez, great-great-grandson of Thomas Webb, your great-grandfather's brother. I kneel before you to acknowledge our family bond and to ask for your blessing as we reconnect our family branches. I promise to honor the Webb family traditions, to support you as our elder, and to work together to preserve the legacy that our ancestors built." Marcus felt tears building in his eyes as he looked down at this man who was humbling himself not out of servitude, but out of respect for family connections that transcended national borders and cultural differences. "I accept you as family, David, and I promise to learn about our shared heritage and to honor the connections that our ancestors valued." Susan Martinez knelt next, her voice steady despite the tears that flowed down her cheeks. "Marcus Webb, I am Susan Martinez, wife of David and mother of your great-great-niece and nephew. I kneel before you to ask for your acceptance of my children as your family, and to promise that we will teach them to know and honor their American heritage. I accept you and your children as my family, Susan. I promise to be the grandfather that Maria asked me to be, and to learn how to be the uncle and patriarch that our family needs." One by one, each member of the group knelt before Marcus and stated their relationship to him, their commitment to family unity, and their hopes for the future. Miguel and Rosa, as the eldest members of the Mexican family, spoke of their lifelong desire to reconnect with their American relatives and their gratitude for finally meeting the keeper of the Double W Ranch. The younger adults spoke of their willingness to relocate to Colorado if Marcus would welcome their help with the ranch operations. Even the children participated, with Maria and Carlos kneeling together and promising to be good great-nieces and nephew to their new American grandfather. When the last family member had knelt and spoken, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the weight of what had just transpired. In the space of a single afternoon, he had gone from being a lonely old man with no family to being the acknowledged patriarch of a clan that spanned 2 countries and multiple generations. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also the answer to prayers he had not known he was praying. "I don't have much experience being a patriarch," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the assembled family, "but I promise to learn. I promise to honor the memory of Thomas and Samuel Webb and all the ancestors who came before us. I promise to welcome you to the Double W Ranch and to work with you to determine how we can build a future together." Rosa Martinez stood and approached Marcus with tears streaming down her weathered face. "Señor Marcus, there is one more tradition. The eldest female member of the family gives a blessing for the future." She reached out and took his hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. "May this ranch continue to prosper under the care of the Webb family for another 100 years. May the children who grow up here carry forward the values of hard work, family loyalty, and respect for the land that their ancestors held dear. And may Marcus Webb know, for all the remaining days of his life, that he is not alone, that he is loved, and that his legacy will continue through the family that has found its way home to him. The blessing seemed to settle over the group like a benediction, marking the end of one chapter of Marcus's life and the beginning of another. As the ceremony concluded and family members began to stand and brush off their knees, Marcus realized that the silence he had lived with for 20 years had been broken permanently. The ranch would again echo with the sounds of family life, children's laughter, and the conversations that occur when people who share blood and history work together toward common goals. What happens now? Marcus asked, looking at the faces of his newly acknowledged family. David Martinez smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Marcus had seen from him since the convoy arrived. Now we talk about practical matters. Some of us are prepared to move here permanently if you're willing. We have savings to invest in improvements to the ranch, experience with cattle operations, and young people who need the opportunities that America can provide. But, first, we hope you'll consider coming to Mexico to meet the rest of the family and see the ranch that Thomas built. Marcus looked out over the W ranch with new eyes, seeing it not as a lonely kingdom that would die with him, but as the foundation for a family operation that could continue for generations. The buildings that had echoed with emptiness for 20 years could again be filled with the sounds of family life. The land that he had maintained alone could benefit from the energy and ideas of younger family members who shared his commitment to preserving their ancestors' legacy. I think I'd like to see Mexico, Marcus said, surprising himself with the decisiveness in his voice. And I think I'd like to learn what it means to have a family again. Maria Elena ran up the porch steps and threw her arms around Marcus's legs, looking up at him with the kind of unconditional affection that only children can offer. "Does this mean you're really going to be our grandfather?" she asked. Marcus reached down and lifted the little girl into his arms, feeling his heart expand to accommodate feelings he had thought were lost forever. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm going to be your grandfather, and you're going to be my granddaughter, and we're going to learn together what it means to be a family." As the sun continued its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch that had been Marcus's solitary kingdom for so many years, he realized that this day had brought him the greatest gift of his life, the knowledge that he was not alone, that his legacy would continue, and that the W ranch would remain in family hands for another generation. The unexpected visitors who had knelt before him that afternoon had given him something more valuable than land or money or even memories. They had given him a future filled with family, purpose, and the kind of belonging that he had thought was lost to him forever. The W ranch would continue, but now it would be more than a tribute to the past. It would be the foundation for a future that honored the best of both family traditions while creating new traditions that reflected the reality of a family that spanned cultures, languages, and national borders. Marcus Webb was no longer the last of his line, but rather the bridge between past and future, the patriarch who would guide his family into whatever adventures awaited them in the years to come.